Hi, I'm Carl Swenson. I'm a course mentor along with Janae Reiser for FDT4 Diversity and Inclusion. Today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the first portion of task number 2 in FDT4, the formal comparative research paper. And the reason that we're looking at this, only a portion of this, is because this is a very complex task, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking with you about where you might want to go in order to get this one started. And then after you get a good start on it, then we'll come back and we'll look at the other part of the recording that will allow you to finish it up. So, task number 2 is basically, as I said, a formal comparative research paper in which we want you to accomplish these competencies. We want you to understand and be aware of differences in cultural norms and values and mores. And we also want you to understand and engage in research activities. Toward that end, we're also looking at these objectives during this task. We're going to describe cultures. We're going to access library resources, both from the internet and possibly from brick and mortar libraries also. We're going to gather and synthesize information, put it together in a new format. We're going to summarize information from multiple sources. We're going to create a bibliography that uses APA style and format. We're going to, with that bibliography, we're also going to create in-text citations and bibliographic citations, and we're going to write a thesis statement or a problem statement as part of this paper. So in order to do this in a really effective way, we kind of have to have some sort of a definition of what we might consider culture. Now, depending on which book you look at and how many books you look in, you're probably going to find a myriad of definitions for what culture is. And because of that tremendous number of definitions and the tremendous variance in what people think, we're going to use a very general and generic definition of culture here. The important thing within this particular definition, there are 2 important points here, and they are outlined in red. So, for the purposes of this paper, a culture is a group of people who voluntarily share similar values, mores, ideals, knowledges, belief systems. Okay, so basically what that means is that we volunteer to be a part of a culture. It's our choice. We want to be a part of that culture, and so we choose to do so. The other important tenet of this definition is that as members of that culture, we really work hard to be accepted and recognized by other members of the culture. And we do that by using the same languages, by living in the same geographical areas, by eating the same foods, being entertained by the same arts, and those kinds of things. So it's very important to understand that those 2 tenets really kind of outline what cultures we're looking at here. As we look at culture, there are a tremendous number of aspects or pieces, if you will, of culture that go to make up the real definition of what culture is. These are some of the aspects that might really come into play based on the research that you're going to do here. When we look at language, we have to understand that language becomes probably the defining aspect of what a culture is. We use particular language within a culture. Now, that might be a spoken language, or it might be written language, or It might not be spoken or written at all, but it might be body language, movement, motions, the way that we cast our appearance, if you will. Um, so think of language in its broader sense. Think of it as a communication between two people, not necessarily a verbal communication, but any sort of communication between two people. The arts and entertainment of a culture is specific usually to that culture. Um, it has a great part in the culture. Often it includes a lot of the tradition and the history of the culture. If we look at the Navajo Indians, for instance, and we look at their paintings and their artwork and their pottery work, we'll find that the story of their culture is told within that artwork. So arts and entertainment become a very important part of what a culture is. Thought and worldview um, obviously has a lot to do with the culture and what makes it up and how it's defined. Um, and this obviously includes the term ethnocentrism. A good way to describe ethnocentrism is this, that um, everybody in a particular culture everybody in a particular culture believes that the rest of the world revolves around that culture. So, ethnocentrist, the ethnicity, the culture is the center of the universe, and everything else around it revolves around that culture. And this is not specific to just one culture, but is general to all cultures. All cultures believe that. I list spirituality as an aspect rather than religion because I believe that religion is part of spirituality. And this generally has to do with value systems that a culture believes in, that a culture partakes in. Spirituality is a very important part. Social activities and interactions, typically, we tend to socialize and interact with other members of the same culture. We oftentimes do not stray far outside of that particular culture um, for our social interactions and our yeah, and for the when we do things with other people, we don't often stray far from outside that culture. So, thinking about those aspects and thinking about those things with culture, let's take a look at the task stream directions for what this task wants us to do. As we begin to look at this task, we're going to find that the task is actually divided into 8 sections, lettered A through H. Sections A and B are here just kind of to get us going. They're here really just to provide us with the focus and the direction that we need to go. We don't have to turn in sections A and B. We're going to kind of use them for scratch paper. We're going to kind of use them to narrow our focus and to figure out exactly where it is we want to go. Excuse me. So as we read these task stream directions, it tells us that we're going to use selected resources to research and report on at least 3 themes, concepts, and ideas, which might include things like lifestyle or values or mores or other characteristics of at least 2 minority cultures living in your state. And I'm going to change subcultures to minority cultures here. I want you to look at the idea of minority cultures. And when we talk about minority cultures, obviously we're talking about cultures other than whatever the predominant culture in that area is. So as you take a look around at what cultures are there, that might be what you're going to be interested in studying. Um, there are areas within the United States that are very homogeneous, if you will. It's mostly just one culture, um, primarily one culture. However, even in those areas, we'll find different aspects of culture that we can study if we want to. Um, if you're in a position where you're in a really homogeneous community, you may want to look to the state as a whole to see what the minority cultures within your state might be, and that way you can kind of look in a little bit broader sense. So, how do we determine what a minority culture is? Well, typically when we talk about minority, we often first think of race when we begin to identify what culture is. Well, that's a part of it. Race is indeed a part of culture, but there are many, many other aspects that we can look at. For instance, ethnicity is one area we can look at, or religious affiliation, religious groups, we can look at that, or social groups, we can look at that. We can look at just about anything as long as it meets the requirements of culture, as was shown to you in that slide defining what culture is. That membership is voluntary, and that members of the culture strive to be accepted and by other members of the culture. So those are the two aspects that we're looking at here. This is your project. This is something that you should actually choose yourself, because if you choose it yourself, then you're choosing it because it's of interest to you, and you're really going to kind of take the time to do this right. So as we look at that, then you can begin to make your decisions as to what minority cultures you really want to study. Here, let me give you some examples of what people have done in the past. People have examined African American culture and the Mexican American culture. People have examined the Native American culture. They have examined different religions, Southern Baptist and Catholicism, examined Judaism and Islam. They've examined the Amish communities in relationship to something else. It's really kind of up to you. I had a young lady up in northern Wisconsin that compared Amish communities to white-tailed deer hunters. She convinced me that white-tailed deer hunters do indeed meet the requirements of our definition for culture. It's a voluntary membership that people strive to be accepted by others. They use the same languages, they have the same mores, they have the same value systems. She convinced me that it was a culture, and I said, okay, that's fine, you can do that. I had a student in California who compared ravers to surfers. So you see, it's really kind of limited by your own creativity and your own imagination. So what you want to do is to study two cultures that are exciting to you and are of interest to you. So when we're looking at Section A, the directions say write a statement of purpose, or a thesis statement, if you will, for your research project based on the minority cultures living in your state. We're going to use this statement of purpose or thesis statement when we begin to write the paper, because it will actually be part of our introduction. But for right now, we need to do this because it really begins to focus where we're going to look in the research. So I want you to write this statement of purpose, and basically it should say, I want to study these two cultures because, and then tell us why it is that you want to study these two cultures. That's going to be what Section A is. Section B allows you to begin to locate the source material that you need. There is a requirement that you have a minimum of 10 sources of information for this project. Some of them will be considered to be primary sources, some of them will be considered to be secondary sources. And we'll get into a discussion of what primary and secondary sources are here in just a couple of minutes. But I want you to begin to locate those sources of information, because without the sources of information, it's not going to be possible for you to write your paper. So begin to look, begin to cruise the internet, begin to to do some searches there to begin to look for the 10 sources that you're going to need. You're going to need a minimum of 5 sources for each of the 2 cultures. Now, the way that those sources are broken down is this way. We have secondary sources and we have primary sources. We'll talk about the primary sources first. A primary source is one that is written or authored or created or produced by someone who is immersed in the culture, someone who is a part of the culture, or someone who has studied the culture for an extended period of time, not just for a week or 2, but for an extended period of time. This might be something like, for instance, if I were studying the civil rights movement, I might want to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's obviously an autobiography is written by him, Malcolm X, and he was certainly immersed in the culture of the civil rights movement. So that would be a primary source. A secondary source, on the other hand, is a source that is authored or created or produced by someone who is an information gatherer. This person gathers information from all different all different types of sources, and puts them together, kind of reconfigures them into another document or creation for redistribution. A perfect example of this would be a textbook. Textbook writers typically draw information from literally hundreds of other sources and gather it together and reconfigure it for redistribution in another form. That would be a secondary source. A newspaper article is typically a secondary source. A magazine article is typically a secondary source. So you see here that there's a significant difference between primary and secondary, and that's kind of where we got to go with this. There are some very specific requirements as to where these sources must come from. You have to have one primary source from a government website, something that ends in .gov. Now, the thought here is that the government, in its production of a website and the information on a website, is considered to be the expert in the area. So, for instance, if you're looking at Census Bureau statistics and demographics, then the United States Census Bureau is the primary author because they are the experts in this. So, with a government website, it's always going to be a primary source. We want you to find another internet primary source. So basically, out of the 6 primary sources, 2 have to come from the internet. One is a .gov site, the other is an internet source. The other 4 you can find anywhere you want. You have to have at least 2 non-internet secondary sources for each culture. This would represent a book or an article that might come from a brick and mortar library. This might represent an article you find in a newspaper or in a magazine. But the requirement is that they be non-internet. So, and that's, there is no give on that. You've got to have them non-internet sources. So of your 10 sources, that's what's going to be required. So we're going to stop at this point and let you begin to think about what your statement of purpose is, and also how you're going to begin to start gathering this source material. What I would do if I were you is I would begin to determine what some of your source material might be. So what you're going to have to do is do a little bit of pre-research. You're going to have to kind of go out and find out if there's information regarding the cultures that you're interested in. So spend a little time with it. When you feel comfortable that you're beginning to find your source material, come back and pick up on the second part of this recording, and then we will drive on into the paper. Thanks very much. Enjoy yourselves. I'll talk to you in a little while. Bye.